We're going to talk a little bit more about HVAC today. I got a few more pointers to give you. I kept trying to figure out what to include in this video and what to put off for a later video, and it seems like the deeper you look into the HVAC systems on cars, the deeper it gets. And the more I think about that I need to say, but I'm just going to try to get through this pretty quick today, because if I don't, it's going to be too long. Now, everybody wants to be in their comfort zone, and that means being in a car with air conditioning. Now, whenever the air conditioner doesn't work, even if everything else on the car works, the radio and the speedometer, it runs good and everything else, if it's a hot day and the air conditioner doesn't work, you got issues. Back whenever I was a single man, I got a date with a really pretty girl on it, but my car at the time didn't have air conditioning on it, and it was a hot day in southeast Texas, and she wasn't having a good time because it was so hot, and she just wanted to go home early. So I bought me a vehicle with air conditioning right after that, because I was thinking, I need the air conditioning too, and I'm not going to be stiffed by a date again for not having an air conditioner. Well, controlling temperature and humidity, in the subtropics where we live, we don't have a lot of dreadfully cold days, but when it's cold enough to freeze, driving a car without heat can be pretty miserable too. But even if the heat works and the AC is out of commission, the windshield won't defog when you turn on the defroster, and so that's an issue too. Now this right here, and I've talked about this a time or two, you're going to have on a fixed orifice system, you're going to have a low pressure, you're going to have an accumulator right here with low pressure gas flowing through it, and you got an orifice tube. High pressure liquid goes to the orifice tube and then turns into low pressure liquid, and then it evaporates in the evaporator and absorbs heat because of a principle called the latent heat of vaporization. Then it's pulled into the compressor, and then that gets sent in here, and it actually turns back into a liquid. Now some condensers, the ones that have the receiver dryer in a little bag on the condenser itself, those are subcoolers, which are slightly different, but what they basically do, besides condensing the refrigerant, they also cool it before they send it back over through the liquid line. And so you got high pressure gas, and this is the discharge line, and this is the condenser. There's a fan blowing on this, and there's a squirrel cage fan here, because they got an airflow across both of these is important. Now on your thermal expansion valve system, this expansion valve is measuring the temperature of this tube and regulating the flow of the refrigerant into the evaporator. If this thing gets stopped up, your AC won't work. And some of these have a little screen built into them. That'll be the old kind, but the block kind doesn't typically have a screen. And the block kind is basically just made so that both refrigerants flow through it, and it can measure it by default. That's another story. The receiver dryer is what you're going to find on one with an expansion valve. You won't see an expansion valve system with an accumulator, and you won't see a fixed orifice system with a receiver dryer. Now some vans have got a separate evaporator or stuff in the rear, and it'll have an expansion valve on it, and that's a different deal. Anyway, I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. And so, let me see here. Any successful diagnostician, if you're working on something that doesn't work right on a car, here's a basic outline. There's several different formats of this. First, you need to verify the concern. Sometimes that can be a pain because the thing won't act up. You can't figure out what's wrong because you don't see what's wrong, and if you just do something, it's probably not going to, unless you're really, really familiar with the system and you know where the weak links in the chain are. If you just throw something at it hoping that'll fix it, they're going to come back and say, that didn't fix it, I want my money back, or I want whatever does fix it done for free, So the best thing you can do is verify the concern, isolate the system, decide what part of the vehicle is causing this, determine the cause of it, and any root cause. Like if something fails and something else caused it to fail, you need to find that something else or it's going to fail again. Anybody that's done a lot of work on cars knows that. Like the spark plugs that look like you'd hit them with a welding machine. That one guy came to me and he says, hey, I replaced this plug yesterday and it's burned up like this again. So he didn't find the root cause. It turned out it had a leaking intake valve that was letting air in there, and it was like a torch blowing on the plug, Determine the cause. When you determine the cause and the root of it, do the repair, and then you verify the repair. Now, the service advisors that I worked with never liked to hear this verify the repair thing. They just wanted you to say, this is what it needs, it won't need anything else, this will fix it, and they'll never even need another oil change as long as they own the car. That's what the service writer wanted you to say, because they want to be the hero. And so I'd say, I won't know until I do this work if it needs any more work. They did not like to hear that, because sometimes it needed more work, and they didn't like having to tell a customer, we won't know what else it needs until we do this. Well, first you need to know how to turn on the AC. It's a funny little story here. When I was at the college, I told one of my students that was in his 40s, country boy that had been laid off from the cotton mill, and I said, hey, go turn on the air conditioner, let's see if this clutch will kick in. And he sat in there rubbing his jaw for a while, couldn't figure out how to turn it on, and he said, I don't know how to turn the air conditioner. It's a Buick Riviera, 85 Buick Riviera, and that thing had a CRT touchscreen, which is fixtured right here. And that was a solution in search of a problem that nobody had, but they just wanted to deal with this technology. This same screen was your radio and a bunch of other stuff, but you had to navigate to this screen so you could use these AC controls, auto, fan, high, cool, warm, all that kind of stuff. These things like to crap out too, and people would have to get them replaced. But the long and short of it is, I sat down in the car and had to figure out how to turn on the AC. It wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be, because I hadn't even been in the car when he sat there and he said, I don't know how to turn this on. Anyway, it's just kind of funny to me. Well, I remember that Geo tracker I talked about a while back that came from the factory with everything else, air conditioning, everything was factory air, the compressor, all the wiring, the receiver dryer, everything was there. The only thing that was missing was the button that turned it on. This was a blind plug that was supposed to be popped out when you stuck a button in it. Then the girl swore up and down she had used the air conditioner the past fall, and now spring was here and it was getting hot again, but she couldn't get her air conditioner to work. And I sat down in there and I looked at it. I didn't see anything here that I could do, so I just turned on the fan and all, and we went to looking, and we energized the compressor and it started cooling, and I said, doggone, what in the world? Then I tracked it down and found out there was no button here. I asked her, I said, has anybody done any work on the inside of this thing, replaced parts of the dash or something? She says, no. And I could have really interrogated her and said, well, how did you turn on the air conditioner? Show me. Well, what I wound up doing on this was just bypassing that button so that anytime she turned on the fan, the compressor would kick in. And that worked just fine, because she could regulate the temperature over here and all that, good grief. But that's been a mystery to me ever since, and I will never figure out how she ever used the air conditioner if it didn't even have a button to turn it on. Well, look at this. Here's the one that came out of the car. Which way is it turning? Let go of it, Joe.
To the right.
All right, it's going that way. Now, hook this new one up. It's made in China. Wonderful. I don't care if it does have the VDO name on it. Now, let go of it. Let go. All right, now, notice that it's turning the opposite direction. It's turning this way. Do it again. Notice how that fan. Okay. Turning the wrong way. Now, that will make the car not have any air hardly at all coming out of the blower. And so we got to replace the blower motor on this one again with one, hopefully, that's wired up right this time. The magnets were put in this motor housing backwards, and the magnets look just alike. They're not even marked as far as I can tell, and they would actually pick them up and put them in the wrong way. After I posted this video on YouTube, I'm talking about this video here, there were people that were telling me that they bought one from Amazon like that. You can reverse the polarity and it will turn the right way, but the next time somebody replaces the fan motor, they're going to have another problem. I always worry about the next guy. I said, I always make sure that I glue the gasket to the water pump instead of the timing cover, so that the next guy, when he pulls the water pump off, he won't have to do a lot of scraping on the timing cover like he would if you use that 3M weather strip adhesive to glue it to the block, to the timing cover. Anyway, you also got these burned out blower resistors. This is fairly common, and you got these stuff that is out of balance fans. They'll jiggle. They'll make the dash jiggle. You find crud in there like that, it throws them out of balance. Sometimes you'll find dead rats in there, stuff like that, and that's never pleasant. But that's just the way it is. But there's a lot of current going to this fan, And anytime you got a lot of current, if you get terminals that start to oxidize a little bit, well, they're going to have current, they're going to have voltage drop, they're going to have resistance, they're going to have heat, and they're going to blister and burn until they melt down and quit working at all. That is very common when you've got a circuit like a blower or a fan, even radiator cooling fan out there, condenser fan. Anything, and the fans consistently pull more current than any other component on the car other than the starter. Of course, the starter only works briefly. And so just keep that in mind. Now there's quite a bit of current coming out of the alternator, but that's coming out, not going in. And so just keep that in mind, because anytime you got a higher current circuit, it's subject to heat things up and melt them down. This is ice issue that was on a Mazda B2300 that belonged to our maintenance man. He was saying the battery will die overnight, and also I notice my AC quits cooling when I'm driving, and it starts cooling good, then it quits, and I lose my airflow. Well, the evaporator was freezing up because his AC clutch relay was stuck closed and running the compressor. It had the compressor energized all night long, and that'll kill the battery. You got about 10 ohms of resistance there. Do the math, if you know your Ohm's law. He's pulling some current there all night long. It just killed the battery. But see, his parasitic drain and his air conditioner that would quit cooling, after he'd been driving for about 10 minutes, were all caused by that one stuck AC clutch relay. See? All right. So, ice issue number 2 was on a Ram, Dodge Ram, like a 98 model, and it had a stuck low pressure cutout switch. And whenever that it would weld it together, the contacts were welded together, and the compressor was basically running along. I mean, it would never shut off. Now, when you turned off the truck, it didn't keep running, but as long as that air conditioner was turned on, see, and that powertrain control module basically is reading both these switches here. But see here, you're going to have this coming through here, and it's going to come through there. And then the powertrain control module, because this never opened, it just left the compressor on all the time, and it would freeze it up. And then we had this one here I talked about a couple of weeks ago and I finally found this. I was looking for this one. I had this. This was the frosted up suction line. This is a liquid line. This is a suction line. Now sometimes if the humidity is high, you may see a frosty suction line, and it's not a problem unless there's some other symptom. On this particular one here, she would lose her airflow, but she wouldn't let me work on it long enough to figure it out. She had to drive it home every day. And remember I told you the register temperature was going down to 20. The evaporator temperature on the PCM, which was how it was deciding when to run the compressor, was 48 degrees. And it was supposed to shut off the compressor at 40 degrees, but it never saw 40 degrees. The PCM didn't. It always saw 48. But anyway, this right here, in reality, it was colder than 48, and so it kept freezing up the evaporator. So, another one of those. This Santa Fe, the dealer gave up on this one after having spent $3,000 or $4,000 of their money replacing everything but what it needed. And this guy here got in there, and he looked up and he did this little control head thing. Turn off the press off switch more than 4 times within 2 seconds while you're pressing the auto switch. The graphics would flash, the diagnosis would start. Anyway, he ran through this and he got the code that told him the evaporator thermistor was open and the air conditioner wouldn't even come on at all. But everything else had been replaced, and they spent a ton of money on it. So we got him a $29 evaporator temperature thermistor, and Lee pulled the dash out of it. This guy helped, but not very much. But he pulled the dash out of it, and he replaced that thing, put it back together. And that customer was so happy with that he says, "Can I give him a tip?" I said, "Yeah, you can't give me one, and I wouldn't take it anyway, but you can give him a tip. And I don't know of any college policy against it, so you just knock yourself out." And that guy opened up his wallet, and he had 8 $20 bills in there, and he gave every one of them to this guy for fixing that air conditioner. I thought that was pretty good. And Lee told me later, he says, "It's a good thing because my wallet was totally empty whenever I got," and he was at school, see, that was a school situation. He basically did a lot of hard work, so I don't think he got, anything he didn't deserve. All right, start out, max AC, low blow. That's where you're going to get your coldest air. Roll up the windows, max AC, low blow, at about 1500 RPM on the engine. You know, hold it about 1500. Look at your thermometer. What do you see? What do you feel? I didn't picture the thermometer, but I like to put one of those in there too. And you need to know, if you can get an assistant to do that, you need to know, is the compressor running, and do I feel a cold suction line? This is a suction line. Remember, the liquid line gets hot. Now, it doesn't get hot enough to put a blister on your hand most of the time, but it does get hot. This one here will be freezing cold, and it'll be sweaty, typically like a glass of tea, and the accumulator will be too. And so I want to feel a cold suction line, and I want it to be all the way to the compressor. If you've got a cold suction line all the way to the compressor's running, but you still have warm air, then you probably have some kind of a heater core or a blend door issue. So just keep that in mind. Don't go looking for a problem with the air conditioner if the blend door is letting warm air mix with the cold, so that all you're feeling coming out of here is warm air. And that's fairly common to experience something like that too, to have nothing wrong with the air conditioner, but it's losing its effectiveness because of the malfunctioning heater system. Alright, no clutch operation. It's a good idea, and you may not even have one of these things. Sniff the juice unless you're the one who charged it last. Now, if you're using a machine, I understand your DIY people don't have a machine to pull the refrigerant out. Don't vent the refrigerant to the air. Just don't do that, because it's against the law. It's like a $10,000 fine. And as a matter of fact, they will pay somebody for ratting you out. So be really careful about that. And so the professional shop, a lot of them don't have these, or they'll have a refrigerant identifier that's on the machine, and that's a good thing. But if they got a refrigerant identifier that's separate, like I was using here, notice this one here was 4% R12 and 95% R134. This one here was 23% R134 and 76% R12. This one here had hydrocarbons in it. So you need to make doggone sure. So what are you supposed to do according to the government 609, Esco 609 regulations? If you find blended refrigerant, you're supposed to pump it out with a dedicated machine into a tank that's gray on the bottom and yellow on the top. That's the right way to do that. So there's a right way and a wrong way to do this, and this is a really strong thing that they're pushing right now, and they have been for years, and that's part of your Esco certification thing. Incidentally, if a person in a shop that's doing air conditioner work is not Esco certified, the shop is subject to a fine. It's like $33,000 or something like that. It doesn't matter if the guy in the next service bay or the service manager is Esco certified, and you can look this up, Esco Institute, esco.inst or something like that. Anyway, look that up. You can actually get Esco certified. Doesn't cost a lot. It's an open book test. I definitely recommend it if you're going to be doing this. If you're not Esco certified and you work on somebody's air conditioner in the yard, you can do that, but you can't get any money for it, or even get a pork chop or a bag of shrimp. Anything changes hands, then you're breaking the law. So if you're Esco certified, you got that card in your pocket, you can actually buy tanks of refrigerant from the parts store. The bigger tanks, and all that. So there's all kinds of perks, and it doesn't, like I say, it doesn't cost very much. It's not hard to get Esco certified. If you're going to do any kind of work on anybody's air conditioner, you need to do it the right way, and you need to make sure that you get that certification. Static pressure check. After you've determined that it's got nothing but the right refrigerant in it, you hook your gauges up, and you're going to see, notice this gauge has got a different scale from this one. It starts at 0 and goes to 350. This one starts at 0 and goes to 500. Now look at where this is reading. It's slightly below 100. This is reading slightly above 100. Truth to tell, you can turn that screw a little bit and calibrate these gauges. They're probably a little off. These are my gauges too, by the way, when I had it hooked up to my vehicle. But the long and the short of it is, whenever you see static pressure, it ought to be really close to the same pressure on both sides, and it ought to go back to the same pressure on both sides pretty quick after you shut everything off. Alright, that's where you're going to start. Now, with the compressor running, again, the suction line should be cold. This is the suction line, and this is a simplified system, like on a Crown Victoria or something. Suction line, it travels this way, goes out of the discharge line, into the condenser, comes out of the condenser as liquid, hits the orifice tube right about here. Now some of the Chevrolet pickups have got the orifice tube right there coming out of the condenser, and they're behind the grill. So you got to figure out where the orifice tube is. Some of the Jeeps have got it built into the liquid line so that you have to change the liquid line to change the, like Jeep Cherokees are like that, and some of the Grand Cherokees, you got to change the liquid line to change the orifice. The orifice is in there where you can't even see it unless you cut the line open and look in it. And I've done that before too. Does you have a clutch air gap issue, like if it cycles on and off and on and off, then it cycles off and never cycles back on whenever it gets to a certain temperature under the hood? If it's running, and like I showed you the other day, you bump this a little bit. Just be careful when you bump it, because if you bump it the wrong way, you can throw the screwdriver back at you, or whatever you're bumping it with. Just bump it with something, and if it clicks in and cools and then clicks back out and doesn't click back in, even though there's power going to the clutch, then you know you've got an air gap issue, and we talked about that on a previous video. Watch the pressures on a healthy system. Temperature and pressure sort of run together on refrigerant. You notice this one here. This one is on a really hot day, and the head pressure is a little bit high on it. Usually the head pressure ought to be back here. It's running a little high, but it's pretty well stayed there. Of course, if you don't have enough airflow, you're liable to have, had to keep going up, keep going up, keep going up. So when you're checking this, if you see this, this right here is giving you good cold air, and this right here is hot air in the condenser at high pressure. Okay. Put a fan in front of the thing and make sure it's got really, really good airflow. You'll be surprised how that'll help you with those high pressures. This one here, the low static pressure, which we hooked up right here, low static pressure here. You notice we only got about a little less than 50 pounds here, and we got a little less than 50 pounds there. That usually means that you've got low refrigerant. Now, I have seen it where you had 90 or 100 pounds of static pressure on both gauges, but it was still low on refrigerant. So you can't always, it's a sort of a static pressure is one indicator, but you can't take that to the bank. As you can't hook the gauges up and see 100 pounds of pressure on both gauges and say, whoop, that's it. That's all I need to know. We got good static pressure. If you turn it on and these start going in different directions, and this one here starts short cycling the compressor, pulls down, it'll pull down and go click, and then it'll go back up, and it'll pull down and go click. I mean, that short cycling typically means either it's cold air outside, like in the wintertime it may short cycle even if it's fully charged. In the summer, if it's short cycling, you better be looking at your refrigerant level, because that's typically what's wrong. Now, these are healthy pressures on a warm day with a good airflow. You notice this right here is up between 200 and 250, and this right here is down just below 40. Now, typically about 24 psi is where a pressure cycling switch will turn off the compressor, and it'll cycle back and forth between those two. But if it hangs in this range right here, and it's blowing pretty cold. Now, when you're trying to find a problem with AC, you need to have it cycling off and on a lot. And so the way you do that is roll the windows up, turn it on low blow, max AC or recirc, so that it's air conditioning the same air, and just wait and let it, and it gets colder and colder and colder and colder in the car, and it'll get to where it's cycling the compressor off and on. You can grab a hold of the pressure cycling switch and feel of it, and you can feel it click. And if it clicks and the compressor doesn't kick on, that's when you start thinking about air gap issues. But if it clicks off and on, every time it clicks, you'll see that compressor click on and all that. So there's some pretty handy stuff there. If it's low on both sides, then that's typically a bad expansion valve. Now, there was one Toyota Camry we worked on. Had the expansion valve under the dash. It was one of those old style. It was an older Camry from, I don't remember what year model it was, but it was in the 80s, mid-80s, I think. And it had low pressure on both sides. And so we went in there and replaced fully charged, but it had low pressure on both sides. And we changed out the expansion valve, put it back on, same problem. So we went ahead and pulled the evaporator off and replaced it, and that took care of it. Now, the evaporator seemed to have good airflow to me. I don't know why in the world it took an evaporator on that one and an expansion valve to take care of this low pressure on both. That's the only time I've ever seen that, though. Typically when you see low pressure on both sides when it's fully charged and is working right, that's going to be, see, it's a lot lower than it should be here, and it's a lot lower than it should be here. It should be up here and it's down here. This one should be up here. And it may start out cooling good and then the expansion valves start acting up, like that edge I was talking about in a previous video, so be aware of that too. Now, whenever you're changing out parts like the accumulator or any of the parts right here, to begin with, you got to think about how much oil the system takes. If you got too much oil in it, it's not going to cool good, because it'll coat the inside of the heat exchangers with oil, and they don't exchange heat very well when they're coated with oil. So you don't want too much oil in there, but you also, if you're making a conversion from R12 to R134 or something like that, you're going to have to put oil in there that's compatible with the refrigerant. If you don't, you burn up the compressor. Okay, so this one here, you're going to see little charts like this in your book. On the AC system, this particular one is different than one I just showed you on the Nissan. 7.75 ounces of refrigerant oil. The accumulator holds 100, this is 230 milliliters. The accumulator holds 120 milliliters, 4 ounces. 1 ounce for the condenser and 1 for evaporator. Now this is what you change. When you change it, like if you change the accumulator, you need to add 4 ounces of refrigerant. Change the condenser, you add 1 ounce. Change the evaporator, you add 2 ounces. Now they say on the compressor you drain and measure the oil. To be perfectly honest, and look at the paperwork that comes with the compressor. Some of them come with oil, some of them don't, and you really need to know that. If this thing says it comes with oil, so don't worry about it, and most of the time they will, because they don't want you just popping it on there, burning the compressor up and sending it back to them as a warranty claim. But if it's got the oil in it, you don't need to drain the oil out of the old compressor and measure it. But you do need to make sure that you know it's got oil in it before you just pop the compressor on. Oh, also, stand it on its nose for a while before you put it on there, and that lets the oil that's in it work its way down here and wet that seal in the front. And that keeps it from being damaged whenever it fires up dry. So that's just a really good practice. When you open the system for repairs, remove the refrigerant the right way or hire it done. You can take it to a shop and say, can you get the refrigerant out of this thing for me because I got to do some work on it. And they'll typically do that. And then you can, you can actually charge it back up yourself. But when you've opened the system on a high mileage vehicle, replace the accumulator or dryer with a TXV or orifice. This right here was one that wasn't cooling right because the dryer came apart and dumped a bunch of these little desiccant beads in here. This won't usually happen on an accumulator, but it will on a dryer sometimes. The accumulator is built a different way so that it's really difficult for any of these beads to get out of the accumulator, even if that bag does bust. These desiccant that gets absorbs moisture out of the refrigerant. The orifice tube really needs to be replaced. It's not a bad idea to flush the thing. One time when I was first learning a little bit about air conditioners back in the late 70s, I replaced the air conditioner compressor that had failed on a Chrysler. It ran in one of them V piston style V air compressors, and that thing ran a little bit and then it started knocking and locked up again. And I called the guy, David Hughes, at the parts house at Spence Battery, and I said, this compressor died. And he says, well, the metal that came from the old compressor all went somewhere, didn't it? I says, yeah, I guess I should have known that. He says, you're going to have to get all of that stuff out of the system or no compressor you put on there is going to survive. And so I didn't have a flushing machine, just didn't have one. But I took the lines loose and I poured every part of that system full of denatured alcohol. Just poured it completely full. He said, you got to have something that'll cut that oil. And so then I put a hose on the, so that it went into a 5-gallon bucket and blew on the other end of each component and blew all of the metal filings and trash and everything. And then I went back in with a new compressor and a new oil charge and a new refrigerant charge. Never had any more trouble out of that one. I flushed it myself by just, coming up with my own method, but it worked the way that I did it. Remember to take out the trash. If you will, this right here, we had to actually pull the radiator back to see all of this garbage. What's amazing to me is this stuff will go through the AC condenser and stop at the radiator. Of course, if it stops at the radiator, it's still restricting airflow. It can cause the engine to overheat, but it can also cause the air conditioner head pressure to go too high because not enough airflow, and that destroys things. This was at my buddy Donnie's shop. He had an AC that wasn't working right on an old Chevy pickup, and he used his borescope, his snap-on borescope, and he went down in there and he took a picture and found all of this trash down in the evaporator housing. So if you don't take out the trash, no matter how many other parts you replace, you're still going to have issues. Look carefully at everything. Look at this cracked belt. And all. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to put a built-in tensioner on one that's got this many miles on it. And I'll pay attention to stuff like this. See how that clutch coil burned out and leaked all of its gunky tar out and everything? Of course, the compressor wasn't energizing on this one. Also, pay attention to the fan. See this fan? This fan was smoking. And a short story on an Oldsmobile I looked at. This lady I knew called me and she says, my car just quit running and I started and it went dead. I started and it went dead and I managed to coast into the store over here. Can you look at this? And I was on the way home from work anyway. When she called the dealership, I didn't have a cell phone then. So I stopped by there where she was. And she had a little 4-cylinder in this Oldsmobile and it had throttle body injection. And she started it up and it went dead. I said, okay, I see what's going on. Let me see if I can figure out why. So I opened the hood, took the top off the air cleaner, and it had that little pod injector in that throttle body and it would spray in fuel. So she fires it up and it runs for just a second, then it dies. But after it dies, the engine has quit spinning, but the injector is still spraying fuel in there. And I start smelling something, which was something like this, you know, the smoke that you smell when you got a burned motor. And I saw smoke coming out of the fan. I said, oh, okay, so we got some RFI going on here. So I disconnected the wires going to the engine coolant fan. And she fired it up and it ran perfect, no problem. Plugged in the engine coolant fan, it died and it sprayed the injector. That electrical noise coming out of that coolant fan was tricking out all the circuits on the computer, you know, sweeping across those wires, generating voltages and all. And so I said, turn off the air conditioner and drive home. Because she had to drive 30 miles. And I later that day I got a coolant fan from the parts store and replaced that her coolant fan and took care of that problem. That just happened all of a sudden though, for her car. Alright, AC components never fail all at the same time. Don't ever use blended refrigerants. Some refrigerant leaks can be difficult to find. We had this van one time that within 2 days it would lose a full refrigerant charge. And when we found that, we had sprayed soapy water on it, charged it up and sprayed soapy water. It was using nitrogen or something. And back there at the back on the suction line where it went to get, you know, where the suction line was crimped together, it had one little tiny bubble that would appear that was about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, and then it would pop. And about a minute later, another one would appear. That was enough. That teeny tiny little leak was enough to empty that system in 2 days. So imagine if you've got one that's leaking down over a period of a month. Now you're going to have to put some dye in there. You're going to have to let them drive it. You're going to have to shine your black light around, see what you see. If you see it dripping out the evaporator drain, you know it's the evaporator that's leaking typically, and so on and so forth. So refrigerant leaks never fix themselves. Oh, here we go. Poor airflow, bad fan, clogged condenser will kill the compressor. The compressor has to work really, really, really hard when those head pressures go high. A lot of compressors have a pop-off valve on them to kind of, you know, let that excess pressure off. And if you hear that going on, you know you need to look at the condenser fan or whatever. Stop leak destroys compressors and ruins things. So you also need to avoid sitting for a long period of time. Don't use stop leak. It's a bad idea. You know, your buddy might have used it and did okay on his car, but if you pull one apart and take the compressor down, you'll see all kinds of crud in there that comes from that. Alright, that's the end of this video, and I'll try to do some more later. And I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you have a great week. And hey, let's be careful out there.